think we are good to get started. So before we kick off the event, just wanted to do a quick introduction to the Carnegie Mellon Tech and Entrepreneurship community, or CMU T&E in short. So we're a global community with more than 6,000 CMU alum. We host a lot of happy hours. We have a lot of different micro communities that each focus on their own interests, like fintech, blockchain, ML, and we host a lot of events like this. So overall, the community is just a great way to connect with other CMU alumni so we can support one another. So if you'd like to get involved, I'll drop a sign-up link in the Zoom chat. And then if anyone's already part of the community, we'll also have a Slack channel specific to this event that anyone is welcome to join. And I'll share some follow-up resources and the YouTube link to this talk. So today, I'm very excited to talk about how to hire an early team at a startup with Peter and Will. So I'll be the moderator for today. I'm a software engineer at Stripe, but led recruiting for a few months while working at a small startup. So while there, despite probably 4 months of dedicated effort, I think we succeeded in hiring like maybe one person. So yeah, this is a hard problem, and it's one of the top priorities for any startup. And for today's event, I have a few prepared questions to talk through, and afterwards we'll do a Q&A. I will exclusively be running Q&A questions through Slido, so I'll also post a link to that in the channel. So to start off, I'd love to do some introductions. So maybe to kick off, Peter, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and a little more about your role as a talent partner at Accel?
Yeah, happy to. Hey, everybody. I'll try to keep it short, I guess, in terms of background. I've meandered my way into doing what I'm doing over, I think, a couple of career transitions, and at one point a master's from CMU, but through Moffett Field, so redheaded stepchild of CMU campuses. But that's where I got my CMU alumni status. Ended up working in the Bay Area on executive recruiting for startups. Spent a handful of years doing that for a boutique firm, and then ultimately transitioned to a bigger firm, started a firm, and then ended up going into the sort of venture talent world, which I guess I would say is seemingly very popular at the moment, but also something that's sort of done quite differently by a lot of different firms. So just depending on, I think how the firm approaches it and what they think the best use of resources are. So I've been doing this at Accel for 8 years. I spent about a year at Greylock before that as well. So I think coming up on 9 or 10 years in the venture talent world. I guess I'll leave off what Accel is, and hopefully folks know some of it. One of the founders of Accel has his name on a building at CMU, so I think some folks are aware of that. But talent for us is, venture's a people business. I spend, if I were to divide, and I have one person on our team, we are a mighty team of 2 people across what's roughly like 5 billion in active funds at the moment under management and 200 plus portfolio companies. So reality is, tactically, there's not a lot I do directly, on that front, just more of how do we build a network? How do we try to be in the right place at the right time, connect interested people into the portfolio? So I'm always happy to sort of pontificate on how to hire and what to do and decisions to make. And then, we end up leaving it to others to really execute on that. But that's effectively, sort of the role here of just kind of getting in the middle of great people. And, ideally a lot of those folks in the network can be advisors, mentors, board members, can be operators in the company. To the main focus of this topic, how do you hire the first couple of engineers? I am worthless at that. So just, let me set expectations at the start. So that's me. That's Accel and talent. So
awesome. I could take over next. Thanks, Peter. I think the first time I actually had met you was I worked at a startup that Series B, and they laid everyone off, and you were with the Accel funded the company. It was a nice experience right after I joined the first startup out of college.
And that happens too, yeah.
Yeah, that's also another thing that does happen. So I'm Will, also I run recruiting from scratch, so I can definitely talk about hiring, first engineer at a startup. Sorry, my dog is right behind me also. She might bark a little bit, but I also started CME Tech and Entrepreneurship. So, through several iterations a long time ago in San Francisco, so it's come a long way. So I guess always nice to eventually be a panelist at one of these events that I used to be the host for. But recruiting from scratch, it's also gone through several iterations. Originally, it was myself just basically being a consultant for early stage companies, anywhere from targeted seed to Series C. I made a move to the East Coast, and during COVID, it was a little rocky for hiring. So actually worked at a COVID testing company for a few months and sold tens of millions of dollars in COVID tests to every type of organization you can imagine. Then earlier this year, I had reincorporated a recruiting company, and we basically do contingent and some executive search, primarily for engineering, product management, engineering being software and hardware. And the team is about 10, have a few full-time employees, and growing pretty quickly. We have many clients. A lot of them are hiring remotely, but there's just such a big demand for hiring right now, so it's quite busy. And that is my background.
Okay, great. So maybe to get started, Will, you could talk a little bit about, just how do founders actually hire their first engineer? Maybe focusing a little bit more on the seed stage.
Yeah, sure. So I've gotten some, work with some firms, venture firms that do, I would say, first investment after, either they go through an accelerator or just raise their seed round. For using an external recruiter, at times it can be helpful, but finding that right hire can always be a little challenging. And, I've seen most successful from a lot of companies is usually they hire someone within their network. So, the first step, I wrote a Twitter post about this a while ago. I'd always recommend doing everything you can to exhaust your network. So if founding a company, regardless if it's coming out of CMU or, after school, you've probably worked with many, especially great engineers. If not that engineer, then they know somebody. But I would just recommend going through every list of person that you possibly know. And then there's other groups out there. I've seen people hire through CMU Tech and Entrepreneurship. And when those fail and you run out of resources, I'd always recommend that a founder, get heads down and be the one to send out cold emails and either use one of the platforms that are out there for hiring that make it, quite easy to get interviews, or start sending a lot of cold messages. I've seen some response rates, definitely a lot higher than using an external recruiter. If all else fails, you're always welcome to contact Recruiting from Scratch or another agency. But really, hiring that first engineer, it does take a lot of work. If you don't have the luck of having your own network, to pull engineers from. So it really just depends. And recruiting is a numbers game. So if you do contact enough people, at some point it will convert. But it is a lot of trial and error, over time, and it does get a lot harder if you are in person. I've seen in-person companies, regardless of size, just have a really hard time building out their team. So remote is definitely an advantage. But on top of that, you also have to make decisions quickly. So if you hesitate now with an engineer, or you try to match other process, it's not going to be a fun recruiting process too. And I can go into a lot more detail about that. But first recommendation is always network, and then when it comes time, you got to spend some money to hire an engineer. If you're trying to hire an engineer cheaply, it's going to be quite difficult in this market. I've never had companies negotiate rates up, but now it happens quite often. It's pretty common that I'll see that now.
Okay. Wait, so I guess when do companies typically start to engage with like external recruiters or like a recruiting consultancy?
Yeah, I've seen it happen pretty early now. So at times it could be when they're hiring their first engineer, second engineer, they want to start engaging with, either an external agency or doing some type of embedded recruiter. Or even if their headcount plan is, 10 plus over the year. I've seen some companies hire a recruiter with 5 people, 10 people on the team, or someone that, plays the role of recruiter. If you can find a good recruiter at a startup that also could take on other functions, I think that could be one of the most valuable, roles that you can have. Given it is very tough to, recruit it. There's a lot of, I would say, moving projects at one time. So being able to find a recruiter at that stage is, it's almost a blessing if you can find that person in this market too. I've seen companies do it, very early. The most common is probably when you get to around a Series A, or if you're later stage, Series C, post IPO, when you have more budget, you basically just need to fill some roles.
Yeah. I mean, not to pile on, but I'll pile on. But that's, I mean, generally back to what you were saying for, and we do seed A, we've incubated things. I would say that we look for the ability for founders to hire, though. Honestly, right out of the gates, like the first, I mean, sort of feels like the first 8 to 10 engineers better come through the network. And not so much the founder's individual network, and who they happen to have known in the past, but who do they know now? As the team grows, there will be other people. When people join something, that's attractive to other people. But generally speaking, just to build some critical mass, we effectively look for the founder to be able to do that. But that's coming from the venture side of it, which is we also, these days the seed is the Series A, and you just wrote somebody a seed check for $8 million, and it seems like they could spend a little bit of that money building out the team. But I think to Will's point too, it takes resources to hire, and I think that's probably one of the things underestimated, by a lot of founders too, just a level of effort in building that out, right? It just takes a lot to sort of get that going, to do that on top of writing code, building the business, doing all the things that you need to do. So back to where then we tend to try to be helpful too is just, what are the resources? Talk to Will sooner rather than later, right? In terms of engaging outside resources for that. There's also, I think, a trap that founders can get into of like, well, I also must be the person that has to hire everybody at the beginning and do all the work and this, even to the scheduling and the follow-up. And it's like, there's a significant amount of effort, hence why you actually hire and build a recruiting team, just because it takes a lot of work to make that happen. So also just as a founder trying to find ways to get leverage. The seed less so, but the A, funding rounds can start to raise visibility, also build out your network. The more potential angels or advisors you have, that is also your network. So we also just really extrapolating on the fact that network at the beginning is probably bigger than a lot of founders realize initially, right? And be shameless, just in terms of asking and reaching out and, basically leveraging everyone at your disposal to try to get to the right folks, and, start to build that early team. And then, usually once you start to get a few good people on the team, that's attractive to others and that starts to build up. But no silver bullet, as Will said, it is really hard. That's just the reality. I think we can make it harder on ourselves. It's also not overly complicated, but again, it's just a significant level of effort. And then, I always kind of approach the team build, the company building aspect. If you're a product oriented person, think about it to your strengths and say, how would I think about my company as a product, right? How would I think about, revisit? I'm always amazed at how things like job specs and what I think I'm looking for. It's almost like I Google something, I download a job spec, I tweak it a little bit, and then I put it out there and hope magic happens, right? Like my job spec will somehow generate really interesting candidates. It's like, usually doesn't work that way. And mostly, what you're trying to do is say, what do I absolutely need? And what is realistic also, right? Like, we tend to also think about filling roles with people that can do literally everything. And that just may not be realistic, right? If you're having a hard time finding or closing the perfect candidate, it's probably because that perfect candidate doesn't exist, or you've created this idea of perfection that really doesn't map to anybody. So really just constant evaluation too in your process. If it's not working, make changes, right? Adapt, change it. Job specs can evolve. They can be living documents, right? Your organization is such that every person you add will bring something that you expected and then something you didn't expect. So how does that ultimately change, your quote unquote future product releases around, okay, and well, now we have this capability on the team, which we didn't expect. So what does that do to these other open roles that we think we need? But I will stop pontificating for a moment, but that's sort of how we think about it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just related to that, like with your experience with startups, like when and how should founders make key hires in domains outside of their area of expertise? Like hiring that first head of sales or head of compliance.
What do you say? I mean, generally speaking, you will have done the job as a founder, though, in some way, shape, or form. I think the one that just came up recently with one of our companies was marketing. That was where the founder just felt they had no idea. Made a marketing hire and made a good one, and I'll come back to how they did that. But when you think about like sales, generally speaking, if you are a founder CEO and you've been building the team and you've got kind of product and ends going and that's working and you're building, you're usually the first salesperson. So what do I need in a salesperson? I need basically, what have I been doing? And not necessarily overthinking the fact that I don't know how to be a salesperson. I think the biggest trap in leadership, of course, too, is thinking I have to be the best at everything before I can hire somebody good at whatever that thing is. And not the case, right? You literally cannot be the best at everything, nor should you be. And so if it's an area that you're not familiar with, I'd start with some advisors. Back to my day-to-day, right? We know a lot of people. So when I get a founder saying, hey, I'm thinking about hiring a head of sales or a head of marketing, or I'm going into a space I don't know anything about, okay, we'll open up the network, talk to a few people that are in that role or generally can help you shape that. What's important, what to look for, what would I hire today? Sometimes that feedback also might be, hey, you know what, I wouldn't hire a leader in that role today, or I'd hire, again, just I got to hire a couple of AEs. Great. Like that's actually not that challenging because you know how to sell. I got to hire a performance marketer. Okay. I mean, at the level you're thinking about in the early stages, that's probably not a super senior person. Get them in there. If they work, great. If they don't, get somebody else, right? But generally speaking, for a lot of those early hires, it's talk to people that you can help you frame your thinking about it, get smarter on it, and and ultimately use once again your network, friends, family, whoever can help you chat with somebody who knows that space. Not bringing them in. I'll throw that out there, caution on that. You don't want to try to like add people to your interview panel just to backfill where you don't feel comfortable. I don't think great people will be excited about the fact that the CEO lacks such confidence in their ability to assess that talent, right? That they're passing it off to somebody else who may or may not be involved in the company other than, maybe they're an angel. If you're lucky, it's an investor. Even then it's still not the best. I think ideally you get a sense for it as a founder and, just try to shape your thinking. And then one thing I will say, like it's references at the end, right, that make the difference in terms of you can do the pattern matching and say, okay, this person has done X, right? Now I need to validate that they actually did X, right? Or that they're a high quality person. That's where references come in. And it can be listed references. It doesn't have to be off list references. But generally speaking, now that you've told me, like we've had a good set of interviews, it seems like you can do the job. You seem technically capable. And basically now what I'm going to do with references is figure out, will people validate that you said you did, right? And if that stuff comes together, I think you can be relatively more confident in you're making a good hire, right? You've got someone that can do the job and they fit your culture and, the other stuff that you can do as a founder. And, then ultimately you're just sort of checking some boxes to make sure that they ultimately can do what they said they did.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I feel like references are one of those great tools that a lot of people just do not utilize.
Yeah.
So
And definitely I want to, I deal a lot with sort of the infinite back channeling too. So there's references can be powerful. Listed references are far more worthwhile than I think a lot of people give them credit for. I think there's this notion that, oh, the people you tell me to call are just going to say nice things about you. Well, yeah, I would hope so. But who can that person come up with that will say nice things about them? Like the quality of the reference list is a big indicator of the quality of the candidate too, right? So your ability, if they're like, oh, I was awesome at company X and I worked with the CEO on this and this and we did all these things, great. And you get to the interview or you get to the references and they're like, well, where's the CEO? Like, why isn't the CEO a reference for you? Oh, yeah, well, we had this sort of awkward situation, all of a sudden it just unravels. And like, so there should be, even in the listed references, right, this ability to say, oh, okay, you can actually get really high quality people to say nice things about you. And high quality references will also be very direct and very balanced. And so, I think that's a key thing too, is never waste the listed reference side of things too. Back channels are great. They're usually quick and high level, just to validate some things. And then ultimately you're doing the work to try to use those references to say, can I make this person successful? And again, what's the quality of those references?
okay, yeah, that's a great point. So I guess, after you've had somebody come in, done an on-site, you've done references, and now you finally gotten them to the offer stage. Like, what are some techniques that y'all have seen that just, help convince people to actually join the company?
Yeah, I think this is just a challenging problem right now where you're always, tempted to interview people with specific backgrounds, or, some companies only want to hire people that have worked at a thing or, one of the bigger startups. And I think throughout the entire process, right, you're building a relationship with that candidate, which is where, having a recruiter or someone that's the point person throughout the process, one, to just build a rapport that they'll be willing to tell you, either who else they're interviewing with, what they're actually thinking, which is why, a third-party recruiter can be helpful. Of course, we're biased towards getting that candidate hired, but you really want to understand, outside of the compensation for that candidate, which you should know, from the first call anyways, talking to that person. That's quite, important thing to know. I think today someone told us they do 2.4 million a year and they're, not even a VP level. So, it's pretty normal that you'll see these quite outrageous numbers. It's not worth time to, although they may have a good background, it's not worth, the time to talk to them. But throughout the process, as you build the rapport, you want to make sure, I like to ask a few questions. One is, if, economic wise, the offer works out, are there any other hesitations you have to accept this offer? Because once you start talking about anything money, you start negotiating, that is what the negotiation is about. So making sure first you're addressing any hesitations that person may have outside of money. And hopefully, it's within the ballpark of the number you're looking for, but at the same time, you have to understand, if it's an engineer, do you need to, bring in the engineering manager or someone deeply technical, which I've seen to work better with someone with a PhD to go through exactly the type of work that you're doing. If it's someone on the, business operations side, it could be better, bring the founder in to say the vision, basically what is the roadmap for the business. So also strategically thinking, like, is it worth the time to do another call with the founder, some other way that you can close that candidate based on they just don't have enough information about, especially at a small company where there's just not as much available. A bit different at, Stripe, where although they may be wondering what team they're working on, it's pretty clear, you can find a lot of information out there about the company, interviews. So just making sure you're addressing all of the hesitations they have. And then compensation, I think now it's very tough to have set guidelines for base salary, because I've seen numbers just get higher than anything I've seen, for startups. I've had companies breaking their compensation range for candidates, and also using other forms of some companies in the crypto space using other assets that they're try to close candidates with. But it is quite hard. I think just having the, reminding yourself if you are a startup, you probably have a 50% acceptance rate, or lower, wherever it may be. Unless you have just a really great team that's started many companies before and, you have the best investors. Even then you're not going to get every candidate. So also keeping that in mind, that a pipeline is important. Just because you also get a candidate hired and signed, you want to make sure they start the first day too. I think it's a lot easier to go someone now, especially when it's remote. You've never met that person face to face. So it could be a little easier, for someone to just not show up. Much more likely at, IC level. But overall, it's just building that relationship throughout the process, keeping them engaged. And you don't want to make a candidate wait a week or two for an answer.
Okay. Wait, so this might be a very tactical question for you, Will, but so how do you typically determine what different compensation ranges should be? And in a remote first world, are they varying by location still?
Yeah, I have just a usual gut feeling from, seeing enough compensation numbers that I can usually estimate someone's salary, what it should be. And I mean, that's also what you're covering with the company. You just understand what is the range that they can offer a candidate. But a lot of the stuff is out there. You should know what someone from Google at a certain level should be making, or someone at a big tech company. And startups usually have the same, compensation, assuming someone doesn't work at a, an IPO that they're for quite a while. But overall, I mean, I think there are a lot of reasonable salaries for engineers, anywhere from the 150 to 150 range. But still, a big piece is being able to sell that equity, being able to sell the vision of where that equity gets to. And then in terms of remote, I have seen companies that it doesn't matter where you're located, which I think is much preferred, in this market, that you should be paid the same amount. Just given if you're trying to retain that person from getting hired at, the other company that is going to be willing to pay them if it's, $20,000, $30,000 more, is quite a small number when you're trying to hire engineers in particular. So I haven't seen many companies, change the compensation range based on location, and some that don't even ask where they're located most of the time, right? They don't really care as long as they can work in the US and they're somewhere in the US. And they'll deal with the, employment issues after, right, that they have to deal with. So I haven't seen that, especially for early stage companies. I think it really starts happening when you build out a internal people team and they start, making the numbers a more structured comp plan. So as you get bigger, you're going to have, very specific things depending on where you're located. It's given it gets tougher to manage too from a founder doesn't really want to manage, changing around compensation depending on the state. It's already complicated enough to just hire someone in another state. Something I'm going through now with my remote team. Yeah, I think just generally from enough conversations, I still have a gut feeling of what's reasonable. But the market, still surprises me a lot in terms of what I'm seeing.
Okay. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I mean, this one to Peter, have you seen like sourcing or just hiring in general change quite a bit now that we are in a more remote first world?
No, unfortunately. I think remote is great. It lets people, be where they want to be. I guess my colleague Paul is fond of saying, if you couldn't hire anybody when your talent pool was the Bay Area, why do you think that suddenly when the talent pool is the rest of the world, you're going to be able to hire any better? So I think it just comes down to, are you actually good at doing what you're doing on the hiring front, right? So do you, if your sourcing didn't work in a smaller area, right, is it going to work any better just because a person can be remote? It's a nice thing to be able to say you can be wherever you want. That doesn't kill the deal, I guess. But I wouldn't say it necessarily is like, oh, well, now I will go, mining for engineers in Denver, Colorado, because, I've heard there's a great talent. I mean, the other thing we run into is everybody wants to hire people that on paper, effectively match all the patterns and de-risk all the things, right? Where they can say, oh, well, I mean, why do I hire or attempt to chase that engineer from Google? Or how do I convince Ken at Stripe to leave Stripe where he's getting paid a crap ton of money and come work at my tiny startup? I mean, that probably doesn't happen, Ken, but I'm just saying it might come up. But so like, you got to look at who is it that you're trying to hire, right? And back to even some of what Will said around, 50% acceptance rate. I always say, if you want to boost your acceptance rate, don't make offers to people who aren't going to accept them. But we still tend to spend a lot of time chasing people that have no interest joining your company, right? Just because on paper they look good, or ultimately they are purely motivated by money. And it's a hard thing. You can't, how do you compete with Facebook and Google and Stripe and whatever? You don't, right? You just can't. There's no way that you want to, nor can you throw the cash at folks that could somehow offset whatever they're getting, just due to the nature of those businesses. I mean, we live in a time now, which I think is the thing that's most different, where, I mean, Will mentioned, you've got kind of engineers with 4, 5, 6 years of experience making $1 million, $2 million, right? Just based on RSUs and the value of the company, and a lot of this stuff. It's it's a little crazy. So even selling the equity dream, right? Of like, oh, well, if you join here, this equity I'm giving you that's worth nothing today will be worth, $5 million in 2 years. And they'll be like, I'll make $5 million in 2 years here. Like, what's the difference? So a lot of it's just back to motivation. And I'm really kind of wandering off your sourcing topic. It just comes down to just, like, can you source remotely better than you could have before? Probably. I would say if you also backed off of chasing people that really aren't interested in joining your company or have no business doing so, sourcing anywhere gets better, right? Because you're actually more targeted on what's worked. I mean, amazing to me is like the folks that are early. This happens quite frequently in our companies, where you start to realize that 20, 30 people in, post Series A or high valuation B, like literally everyone on the team would not get hired today because of how they've set the bar for the next set of people to get hired into the company, right? And it's like, well, we must hire someone who's been at Stanford or CMU or Harvard and they've worked at this company. And you look around and go, but like half the people on the team didn't come from there before and they're doing great, right? But for whatever reason, as companies get bigger and more successful, there's this tendency to sort of chase the really obvious candidates, which everyone else is doing as well, which then gets into, challenges around compensation and motivation and everything else. So I think I answered that question, but the previous one too of, is sourcing easier? No, only if it was broken before you started, like, remote doesn't really gain you anything, in my opinion, right? And so it's really just about, how do we fix it from the beginning to say, who are the people that we need here? Where are we finding great talent? And I'm going to go after those people, right? And by the way, finding great talent doesn't mean I'm just going to pattern match to where I think great talent comes from, even though I have no direct experience with that, and try to hire people I shouldn't. I'm actually going to say, where have we been really successful? Where have great people come from? And let's focus on folks that look like that, right? Who might be more likely also to just join an earlier stage company, be more excited about the scope of work, the autonomy, the other things that come with it. And even back to closing people, right, is like, if you're down to numbers, you've lost them. There's no, I mean, even if you ask the question at the end of, all things being equal, which they won't be, would you say yes to this job, right? And yeah, I think that's where I'd also highly recommend just optimizing and being more efficient on your process. Is you can tell pretty quickly when someone's not going to work out, right? Just because you hope and pray that they do, that's not a strategy, right? It's not like, well, if I just like keep talking to them and I don't really get into the details and we don't get to the point where they got to make a decision, maybe they'll join, and it's like, well, no, like, move on, like say that's not going to happen, or have a direct conversation, right? Like, I think the thing we lose a lot of too is just Be very upfront. Hey, we really like you. We want you to join. Okay, what's next? And we can talk through the numbers. This is the reality of what we can pay. And is that exciting to you? If not, got it, move on. I'm not going to keep, spending time on this, right, when we're not going to get there. Sorry, that was a bunch of answers to things. So
Yeah, it's all great content. So I think we have time for
I can also
one more
answer the
question.
sourcing question, because that's what I spend a lot of time doing.
Okay, great.
I think it, when it opens up the market, right, of the total amount of candidates that you can contact. So if it's a volume game, you have more candidates you can target. But finding the pattern matching can be very difficult, because outside of, the normal places you go is San Francisco, New York now, or smaller, there's even Seattle, LA, places that have, fairly big tech companies and tech talent. It could just be harder to pattern match, given there's, now getting into company names you've never heard of, schools you're not as familiar with, and just culturally, can't be different of what the expectations are there, versus San Francisco, which is, when hiring there, it's fairly straightforward what a startup looks like, what you're supposed to do. There's generally, it's a playbook for it, right? So I think it was a little bit easier to pattern match, but it can be a huge advantage if you can figure out, how to source at scale. But I don't think a startup can necessarily figure that out. With my team, we're able to, push up the numbers into the building up massive lists of, you get into the thousands or tens of thousands or 100,000 candidates, then you can really start, and you have quite a large recruiting team. You can start, finding those candidates, which my team has been able to do, but it's not something that I would expect, a founder to do, or, it would take a lot of luck to find that person in a lot of interviews. So, but which Peter was mentioning, of being realistic, right? If you have the background of working at, the companies that are name brand, you've done, you've been promoted quickly, you're a high achiever, and you're raising money, and your company has the best investors, your team is all from the same places, then you should target those companies. And yes, you can. I've seen many companies be able to hire an engineer from Google, directly from Google or Instagram, or the normal companies. But if you have none of those credentials, you have investors that are a bit different, maybe a market that's not very interesting, outside of consumer, you probably should. It's a little tough to hire someone from Instagram, right? So it also is just a matching of what you're working on and what it interests that person, and just being realistic with yourself of who are the people you can actually hire, would they want to work here. There's plenty of great engineers out there, but they're being realistic is always the case of, will this person actually want to join after talking to you? Will they be impressed by talking to you? And I've seen that happen many times, right? From, engineers that are, and from every company, depending on which team we're working with. But that doesn't mean that, a company can't get to a huge valuation, do crazy revenue, because there's plenty of those companies that, hire engineers away. And then down the road, if you have a great profitable company, you can always go poach engineers from, wherever you'd like at that point. So, but I think that's always a challenge of founders, of just being realistic, and just, like Peter mentioned, knowing where the right place is to hire from, and then really exhaust all the resources in that one place, rather than trying to take a little risk on trying to find the candidate that's somewhere else in the US that you know nothing about, nobody that knows them, nothing about the company they work for. That's even a challenge for myself, qualifying those candidates and just like taking a chance. But my team is willing to do that. We have a lot more resources to do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'd love to move on to the Q&A. So if anybody has any additional questions or follow-up questions, feel free to add them to the Slido. And Slido has a voting mechanism. So we'll try to get through the top couple questions. So the first one, maybe I'll direct this one to Peter. is from Kashan, and it's just, what are some common misconceptions that first-time founders have with regards to hiring?
I hit on a little bit on that question on, just how do I hire for something outside of my expertise or what I'm comfortable with? And I think, generally there's I think a misconception of, I can't hire that role, or I've got to figure out some way to do that. And the answer is yes, you do got to figure out some way to do it. But I would always say to any entrepreneur, any great entrepreneur founder, step back and say, okay, I mean, I've started this company, right? I took a big swing. I've done what many people don't do. And so, the fact that I could go out, like, build this product, take on this thing, this challenge, solve this problem, and then suddenly when it comes to hiring people, throw my hands up in the air and go, I have no idea what I'm doing, and this is the hardest thing ever. It's like, I always try to push back really hard on that. Is like, any of the barriers to hiring people that you have in your mind would not have been barriers to you starting your company or building your product, bottom line. So treat it the same way. I think, find great people to help you, surround yourself with folks that can speak into that, right? Give you guidance and help you navigate it. But definitely, the lack of confidence can show through as well on the hiring side too, if you're not careful, obviously. So, I think as a founder, again, just sort of feeling like you're not qualified to hire people will be something that people will pick up on. And then, I touched on it a bit too. I think we tend to, as a company gets big. I mean, I think early founders, you do whatever you can, right? You hire interesting people, scrappy folk, friends, family, neighbors, whoever will join, right? And, amazingly, that stuff can work out, right? And, then what I think happens is as you get investors, and I believe we are horrible enablers of like, oh, we just put money into this company. So now the founder switches gears and say, my investor has this different perception of who I must have on my slide deck, right? And the types of people I must hire. And, ultimately you're like, well, I've been trying to hire X and we're looking for this particular thing because I think that's what you want. It's like, well, that isn't necessarily what we want. And, you want to get the best person in there that can help you get from X to Y. One other misconception is like, I must hire the person today that can take us from 0 or 50K in revenue to 500 million in revenue. If anyone finds that person, let me know, right? That'd be great. Very few people have that wide of a band of being able to scale with companies. Some do. And that's the amazing thing too about early startups, where like people with random backgrounds will suddenly become that, executive that scaled through 0 to, 500 million. Generally, they don't tend to come back and do that job again. But hire for what you need for the next year, right? Sometimes, and I think it's, a little Moore's law stuff of just like, in your early days, hire what you need for the next 6 months. And that can expand out. Maybe as you get bigger, you're hiring for the next, year, then 2 years, 2 to 3 years. But ultimately that perpetual chase of like, oh, I've got to get the person, and I get it. Like, I think too, there's just this desire to say, if I hire this person, then I don't have to think about that anymore, right? And they will help me scale the company, through many hundreds of millions in revenue. And it's a nice thing to think about. I think it's just, it's not practical. It doesn't solve your short-term needs. And, really just sort of zeroing in on what do I have to do today, to get the people around me, to get the company to where we want to be in the next 6 months. And then we'll look at the next 6 months. You can have a 10-year plan. And to me, that's, great if in terms of, hey, we'd love to navigate there eventually. It's going to look like this incredibly wandering line trying to get to that point. And that's okay. If you're making adjustments along the way, ultimately getting there by doing incremental work and evolving as you go and being agile and adapting to what happens, I think is the way that, kind of gets you to where you get to those bigger numbers. But back to the specific answer, the misconceptions, just like, this person I hire must, take us from X to Y, and it's a range that's just not realistic.
Okay, great. So I guess related to the first part of that answer, just, lacking confidence that you actually can hire. For somebody that's new to the Bay Area that doesn't have an established network, is there a good way to actually establish that network and hire, your first engineer?
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead, Peter.
well, and I saw the question there on like hire an engineer pre-seed, right? My advice there is hire whoever you can talk to that's willing to work for you. But even like a pre-seed engineer might be a co-founder, right? I mean, there's different things you have to do. I mean, the lack of a network in the Bay Area is definitely a challenge if you think I'm going to come to the Bay Area and build my company in the Bay Area and hire people from the Bay Area. If your lack of network in the Bay Area is offset by the fact that I have a network somewhere else, then build that thing somewhere else. We have many successful companies that didn't get started here. The flip side is the exact pattern match of the perfect sort of, rocket ship unicorn seed to Series A type of deal. It's those 3 engineers from Slack, who knew everybody else at Slack, and then they started building this product, and then their friends got together, and all of a sudden you got this core of like 10 amazing people, but it's because they all work together, right? And it's a bit of an unfair advantage in that network. And then those are the companies that get all the funding, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're saying, I'm a person who's coming to the Bay Area trying to build this thing here, my first question is why? Don't come here and build it somewhere else. Hire some really smart people who are great. And as you scale and grow to the point where the company becomes far more interesting, relatively speaking, gets that funding, right, gets notable investors, has people involved that make a difference, then your network is suddenly, in a better position to help you hire here. But, my advice again at the beginning is, if you don't know anybody here, don't try to build it here.
Yeah, and I think there's many ways to build a network, or I always look at like, what is the purpose of what you're doing? So if you have, if you have a product that works, there's plenty of options of, accelerators, or I mean, CMU, T&E as an example of getting involved, but I think there's better things you could use, like an accelerator, right? And apply to Y Combinator if you could get in Techstars, one of the many that are out there, as, stepping stone to the next thing. If you have the ability, to grow quickly without raising money at the moment, try to just build a great product. And, if you get noticed, that's also very helpful, because people will also chase you if you have a great product. And, that happens too. I think it also just takes meeting the right person, and one person can lead to, just quite crazy things depending on who that person is. You just have to find a person then that's well networked if you have a network. There's many ways to do it. And I think if you're, moving to the Bay Area for that purpose, I don't live there anymore. So I think, other ways you could get involved. If I've seen people be very active on Twitter, and you can really contact anyone there, right? So there's plenty of ways to build a network, especially remote. You can be much more, it's not very spontaneous, but very direct on who you contact, given you can find anyone's email. If you have a good product, if you have a good background, people are willing to look at your idea. There's always investors looking for something, to invest in. There's plenty of people out there that will give you money. So again, it depends what you're trying to solve without having a network. And there's plenty of paths that can get you to, if it is a seed or a series A, plenty of ways to do that.
Right. So another question was just, have you seen some techniques that help create a diverse engineering team? And, how can you make that happen from the early days?
Yeah, I've seen that be just like a very tough thing to solve at companies where, if they tell my team when they're 100 engineers that the team is 90% male, they want us to source diverse talent. That's very difficult for our team to do, given looking at their team itself, right? It's already fairly late for them to do that, right? And if they're going to try to build a diverse team by having non-executive hires come in, or leadership in place, it just can become very difficult. So I think a strategy that, if you do that early, and which is where, remote can be helpful, given you can find, if you invest time, it does also take time. It takes more resources, which is since there's plenty of tools that exist that you can use that, help you discover diverse talent. You have to spend a lot of time to do it too, if that's, not your network. If you only hang out with people, say, from CMU, right? Wherever it is, right? Diversity of education, diversity of race, gender. It's just, I think that's where remote can be great, right? Given anyone can apply for your job, geographically they can come from anywhere. And, for my team, I've been able to build a very diverse recruiting team, just given they come from, really, they don't have to live in California or New York. There's people in many different states. Anyone can apply to the job based on where I put it. So it does take resources to do, and if you're looking to build out a diverse, company that is diverse, you should really focus on leadership too, rather than finding, individual contributor roles or engineers. And there's recruiting agencies that, focus more specifically on diversity. You also should be cautious of your hire, what you're actually hiring for and how you write your rec, given if you're trying to find, say, an engineer that already doesn't exist, like it'll be very difficult to find, that same engineer that's diverse, right? If your rec is already just very, very specific in terms of what you're looking for. And then it also helps really building out your hiring process as much as you can to be unbiased, right? So making sure it's very well structured. So you're not getting people in your hiring process that are making up questions on the spot, that they know what questions to ask, they know what they're measuring for. And then reevaluating that every so often. Like, you also need to look at the data, if you can't just go off intuition. So there's a lot of ways to do it, and it's going, like anything for recruiting, it's going to take time and resources. So, I think it's very, a very important thing to do, especially on my team, which is why, I focus on making sure I hire a diverse team. And it's also helpful to have recruiters, that can, even the recruiting team herself, being diverse is helpful. I don't think there is an easy way. It's not a thing you can solve by asking a recruiter to do it. People ask me that all the time, ask my team that all the time. And yes, there are things that we can do our best, at finding candidates that are, not just someone that's graduated from CMU or from Google. But I would invest resources. Like, you have to do that. You have to invest time and resources.
Right. So I think we have time for one more question. And for anybody that needs to drop off, we would love any feedback on the event. And I posted a link to a post-event survey in the chat. So for the last question, this one's also from Kishan, but it's, what do you think are the most important qualities to look for in an early hire? And what are things that you should not compromise on?
We say don't compromise on fit. Yeah, early hires, I think, and this probably touches on the diversity question a bit too. The reality is you need to find someone that aligns with what you're doing, right? Believes in what you're doing, and then ultimately is a fit. I think early on, you often don't feel like you have the luxury of making that decision. You're just hopeful that somebody accepts your offer, which I think you also got to kind of get out of that mode. But I think, always put, silly analogies, but like things that, dating and marriage and all that goes along with the recruiting process, right? And, ultimately making decisions to hire someone when there was just something that didn't seem right, right? Much like, you don't fix the person after you're married, right? The thing that was a little wonky in the interview, and I tell people that on the other side of the equation, right? Like same thing when you're making that decision to join, like in an interview process, everybody's kind of on their best behavior. So ultimately, you know, if something's weird in that, you got to run that down. It doesn't mean that, you know, there can't be weird interactions and, you know, fits and starts and other things when you're hiring, but just ultimately no one can have questions about, you know, is this going to work out, right? Is this going to be a good fit for me? Not am I technically capable or any of those things, and vice versa on the candidate, but just like, are they going to be a good fit here? Now, a good fit, of course, starts to then feed into the whole challenge around diversity. What does that mean, right? Are they just like me? You know, do they say and do everything I say? You know, I think being really deliberate on what fit looks like, right? Which is you're actually hiring for someone who brings things to the table that you don't have, you know, but then ultimately there's just a good rapport. I look at the chemistry and the fit piece is just more, we can have like just direct and straightforward conversations, right? And we are very effective at getting work done. Not I just made a new best friend and we go out, you know, drinking beers on Thursdays. It's more like we have a good communication style, right? Like the interactions, even in the interview process, they're not like awkward or short or weird. Like it's just like this works and it's gonna work, you know, when we're actually working together. But you know, also I would push on spend time with, you know, in the interview process, not like a take home, you know, coding test or whatever, but literally like, hey, here's what we're trying to solve for. Like this is one of our biggest problems. What would you do? I mean, you know, don't try to debug the for loop that I wrote on the chalkboard or the whiteboard, right? And see if you're any good. It's more like, here's a real world example of, you know, what we're trying to solve for. How would you go about doing this? And in that interaction, right, starting to say, how do we work together, right? Like find opportunities to do a little bit of work together with someone, once again, to just sort of get back to how do you assess fit? And my bottom line, again, I don't compromise on that. I think that's a mistake that, you know, people will make, just like, well, you know, they seem kind of like a jerk, but they're really smart. So I'm gonna hire them anyways. And it blows everything up, right? So.
Yeah, I can, I know we're running out of time. I would say, you know, making sure that, you know, if there is red flag, right, if they're willing to do that interview process when they don't know you at all, you know, just imagine what happened when they work at the company, when they, you know, actually become, you know, more comfortable with you, right? And I've seen that many times in an interview where you know, just have things that I'm surprised that the candidate actually does that, you know, in the interview process. But I think there is, you know, making sure that you are hitting certain criteria, right, of what you're actually going for. And, you know, if you don't know enough about that, maybe some skills that they have, you can dig into that skill set, right? You can also find other ways of getting that information, or making sure there might be too many things you're trying to look for a candidate. You know, if someone is really excited about what you're trying to do, they are willing to, your job is going to change quickly also, you know, on the startup. The company is going to double in size. You could triple in size in a year. It could grow faster than that, right? Depending on how the company is like. So making sure that, you know, is this person also comfortable in that environment? So if you're noticing any of these things, I think it's, you know, one good to gauge more. But it's also nice to have comparisons too, right? If you're just interviewing one person rather than, you know, many people, it's really tough to know what good actually looks like, right? So you want to make sure also that you're interviewing enough people, your team is seeing enough, you know, candidates come through to actually understand, you know, what does a really good candidate look like when you're interviewing them. You're only talking to a candidate a month, 2 candidates a month, you know, that's just not enough people to know. Overall, what a really good engineer looks like, or backend engineer. So just making sure, yeah, I think don't ignore the red flags too. You know, if there is a red flag, if you keep thinking about it, if you're second guessing it, probably a good idea that there's some intuition that you should have.
Great. Yeah, that's great advice. Well, I know we're at time, but I think I can speak for everyone saying that, you know, learned a ton, and thank you guys for taking the time.
Yeah,
Thanks
thanks for
having us.
listening. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya.